Hello friends, this is David Sami with A Christian Journey. We are doing a series on angels and their influence on humanity. And this is the second part of our series where we turn our attention to Satan. We want to look at Satan and dispel some of our preconceived ideas that are based on the culture rather than the Bible, and see what the Bible teaches about Satan. His creation, his career, and his fall. This is such a comprehensive subject that we need to have a part 2 for the next time to complete our study, because to do justice, we are not able to fit it all into one short video. So today we primarily are going to look at his creation, his career, and his fall. And Lord willing, next time we look at how he influences humanity through his proxies. Now, what is interesting is, according to Barna Group, 40% of Christians believe that Satan is not a living being, but is a symbol of evil. Now, is he a real being, or is he a representative idea of evil? You see, I've heard many people would say that they agree there is an evil force in the world. However, they don't believe in a literal being named Satan. Now, something we need to keep in mind is force is neither good nor evil. Force does not have any morality attached to it. For something to be evil, it has to come from a source that has a mind, will, and the ability to commit action that we can perceive to be evil. So in other words, it has to come from a being, not a force. Satan is a being, and he has a will, he has a mind, and he committed action that are profane, and as we see, contrary to God. Now, 2 books of the Bible give us a glimpse into this being. One is Ezekiel chapter 28, and the other is Isaiah chapter 14. Now, on both of these chapters, the prophets, they discuss 2 earthly kings that had an issue with pride. But in both cases, the prophets go beyond an earthly king to a divine being who also transgressed and fell from his lofty position. In Ezekiel, the message is to the prince of Tyre. However, in verse 11, now this is chapter 28, verse 11, the Lord instructs Ezekiel to take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. It's no longer the prince that is in view, but the king of Tyre. And this shift is significant because it shows us that the subject has changed. It's no longer about an earthly prince, but it's about Satan. And in verse 12 and 13 we read, "You were signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was your covering on the day you were created." Now, a few things that we should highlight here. First, this being was full of perfection, not only in his wisdom and his good sense and skill, but also in beauty. He was the completeness of beauty. And every precious stone was his covering, that we could see a dazzling brilliance about Satan that illuminated him. And not only that, but it also signifies his position of authority, because we see the priests in Israelites that they would have these precious stones as their covering, the high priest would have. And that signified his position and where he stood. But also it's the same with Satan, that these precious stones not only signify his position of authority, but also how illuminated and how beautiful this being was, how radiant he was. An absolutely perfect being. But here we have to dispel two false notions. One is the image that we have of Satan. We usually think of Satan as a little guy in a red suit with a pitchfork, and we think of how can something like that exist? This is just a matter of fiction. It's something that people created. Well, nobody ever thought Satan was a man in a red suit with pitchfork. You see, in the Middle Ages, they took the idea of Satan very seriously, and they recognized him as a proudful being. And they thought the best way to get rid of a proudful being is by making fun of him. So they began to draw caricatures of a red man with a suit, thinking that he could not stand being made fun of and he would leave him alone. That's where those ideas come from. But nobody ever thought Satan was a little guy in a red suit with a pitchfork. And another question that I frequently hear from people is, why would God create Satan in the first place? You see, we don't see a malignant being. God created a beautiful being with perfect in wisdom and beauty for a special task. But Satan's desire made him to become an adversary. It was a self-will decision on his part that made him to become contrary to God and become an opponent to God and to us. So it wasn't that God made Satan. God made a beautiful being that he made himself to become an adversary. Now we see this being in Eden, the garden of God. Now this is referring to his presence. One of the questions that I was as a matter of fact, contemplating is this just referring to the time that he tempted Eve in the garden, or did he actually have access to the garden as part of God's entourage, as part of his heavenly council? Now this is, again, it may be a conjecture on my part, but I do believe that he had access to the garden, and possibly Eve have seen him before. This may explain why Eve was not surprised when Satan talked to her in the image of serpent, or in the image that he had. This may explain why Eve was not surprised. Maybe she talked to him before. That could be a possibility. Again, I put that as a conjecture on my part, but I do feel that he had access to garden on a regular basis. Now, verse 14 would tell us his identity and function. It goes on to say, "You were an anointed guardian cherub. I place you on the holy mountain of God." Now, cherubs were the guardians of the throne of God. They were in the presence of God himself. They were there to make sure nothing unholy or impure will come into the presence of God. And the Lord anoints Satan to this place, to function in the inner courts of heaven itself and in the presence of God. And God said, "I place you on the holy mountain of God." Now this could be a literal mountain, or it could be a figure of a speech referencing God's government, that he had a high place in the Lord's government. Now in verse 15 we read, "You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, until unrighteousness was found in you." He was upright and mature in his character and his course of life. He was blameless until at some point in time unrighteousness was found in him, until he committed some act of moral evil or injustice. But what was it? The Bible gives us actually two acts of unrighteousness. One was possibly his method of dealing with God's creation, and the second was the attitude of his heart. We read in verse 16, "In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned." Now, the word abundance is an interesting word. It means head, greatness, one in high authority. Satan had a high authority and position in heaven. He may have been involved in contact with many of God's creation, and maybe he used his position of authority and acted in a cruel and violent way until violence became his method of dealing with other creation of God, possibly other angelic beings, other spirit beings. Maybe he became very cruel with them because of his high authority, and he began to behave in a way that was cruel and violent. Now, his second act of unrighteousness is found in the attitude of his heart. We read in verse 17, "Your heart was proud because of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor." He corrupted his wisdom, his prudence, which he originally was made and to be a complete being because of his beauty. He got uplifted because of his splendor. In Isaiah 14 tells us what was the attitude of his heart. What did he say in his heart? In Isaiah 14 verse 12 to 15 we read, we see 5 I wills that Satan made in his heart, in his inward reasoning. I will ascend to heaven. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly. I will ascend above the heights of clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. He had the desire to be independent of God. He wanted to be in charge of all the other heavenly beings, and maybe thinking that I could run things possibly even better than God. I should be in charge. And he wanted to be like the Most High. I wanted to be like God and basically be the ruler over all God's creation. Now the Lord judges Satan for his transgression. We read in verse 16 that the Lord cast Satan as a profane thing from the mountain of God or the government of God. The Bible Knowledge Commentary points out that Ezekiel presents the fall of Satan as a single act, but in actuality it happened in stages. You see, we see Satan's initial fall from the government of God. And as a matter of fact, this is referenced by Jesus in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, where the Lord says, I saw Satan fall from heaven like a lightning. Now, excuse me, but he still had access to God as the accuser of brethren. We also possibly see him in the book of Job. So even though he lost his position in the government of God, he still had access to God. And what is interesting is in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1 through 4, we see Satan being presented as a dragon, and he's waiting to devour Christ. But the text says the child was caught up to God and his throne. And after this, we see war in heaven. In verse 7, at the defeat of Satan and his forces in verse 8. Now, one of the common belief in today is that we think of the book of Revelation after the 7 letters to 7 churches. We think of all of that book pertaining to future events. That may not necessarily be correct, because I think there are many differences of views in regarding to the book of Revelation. But one dominant figure, one dominant way of looking at the book of Revelation has become the futuristic way, that we think of after the 7 letters to 7 churches, everything pertains to future. And maybe down the road we'll talk more about eschatology and things of the events of the last time. But for now, I want to highlight a few things for your consideration on that chapter, chapter 12. First is that when we see basically after the resurrection, there is a war in heaven between Michael and his angels and Satan and his angels. And Satan gets defeated and he gets thrown to the earth. And then it says basically that Satan has no more access to heaven, no more access to the presence of God. He's thrown to the earth. And now the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come, just like what Jesus said to his disciples. All authority has been given to me on earth and in heaven. Now, then we see the devil having a great wrath, and he goes to pursue the woman's offspring who hold the testimony of Jesus. And all we have to see is the persecution of the Christian in early centuries. That might have been what is being described here, where Satan goes after the offspring of woman who hold to the testimony of Jesus. And this is clear indication to the believers, how he goes after the believers. And how they overcome him with the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives unto death. And this is exactly what we see in the early centuries of Christian era, how Christians overcome his intention by not loving their lives to death, by holding on to the word of their testimony, and by the blood of the Lamb. So maybe this chapter 12 would paint a picture for us that what took place after Jesus' resurrection. But we typically think of these things as future events, as yet to be. Now we can see these things took place again after Christ's resurrection. But now Satan and his angels are operating on planet Earth. And he works through his proxies, both spiritual and human, to influence our lives. And next time, we want to go more into how he operates and how he is able to deceive us. What are his methods and how he still influences events in the lives of human beings today. So this is going to be our second part of the subject of Satan, to look at Satan. Well, until next time, may the Lord bless you, may he keep you, may he make his face to shine upon you. This is David Sami with a Christian Journey.